Welcome to Inside the Mavs. Kevin Gray, Mavs insider for 105 through the Fan, joined as always by my partner Grant Afseth of Mavs SI, talking all things Mavericks basketball here. Appreciate you joining us on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcast for free. Give it a 5-star rating and write a review while you're there. And of course, you can check this out on YouTube as well. We'll put the link out so that you can watch the video as well. But for those listening on the podcast, really appreciate you joining us. However, and wherever you may be listening to us. Before we get started today, Grant, what's going on? How you doing?
Well, I'm doing pretty good. Looking forward to another episode for sure.
Yeah, man. Appreciate that. Looking forward to diving into some Mavs topics. We got a couple of things to dive into. And it's funny because when we get ready to do these episodes, I start to think about, well, what do we want to talk about on a particular episode? And for some reason, the basketball gods, and in this case, the Mavs gods were like, hey, Kevin, don't even worry about it. We got you. And of course, Luka Doncic on his Instagram, apparently taking a picture with a young fan, showed off what looks like, Grant, his new body, his new physique, maybe. Now, before we jump into it, people say, look, why are y'all obsessed about Luka's body weight, what he's looking like, this kind of thing? But I was telling Grant before the show, this is kind of a thing, right? We've kind of been talking about this for a while, and we get skinny Luka apparently showing up on Instagram today.
Yeah, for sure. I think, honestly, with knowing a couple players myself, I think one of the big things I feel like with weight and Luka in particular is that I think like the off season is not necessarily the most important part. I think, like there's a lot of like the weight room pictures for players and things like that, in any league. People get excited about him. I think he does a good job, dating back to last year, of showing up in shape. I think the big thing is like when you start the whole season and you're going on like the long road trips, and then you're like, having to sustain, like your, I guess you could say discipline or your plan or whatever you want to call it for 82 games. I think like some players I know, they've struggled with like at times. Like sometimes there's just like a little bit of a deviation from it. And then they start to deal with like, all right, I got to, get back on track or refocus. So I think that's like the big thing in general with the weight is that like, showing up from day one is great. But I think the challenge, honestly, is the sustainability of it throughout the full season. And Jokic, for example, before we talked or got on here, we talked about Jokic. You hear anyone talk about him. And now it's like he has impeccable conditioning. I actually just heard like Doris Burke, praise Jokic's conditioning in that way before I even like came on here. So I think like that's probably the next step is just like, from start to finish, maximizing that sort of discipline or like, I don't know what he does, in his day to day, but like just in general, like if you can be as like locked in or, 100% or close to 100% as those types of guys like a Jokic. I think that's the big key for sure.
Yeah, because all jokes aside here, this is more about can Doncic now for the rest of his career get his body in the kind of physical shape that can not only withstand an 82-game season, but if we believe this team is going to have the kind of success for years to come, there's going to be multiple deep playoff runs, and his ability to have his body where it needs to be, that is paramount for this franchise and its success. And that's why I think it's such a big deal when we see these photos or these videos of Luka working out or whatever the case may be. Fans, I think, are wondering if the corner is about to be turned with him when it comes to his physical health and fitness, to the point where there's confidence that we can start to not have to be talking about Luka and the weight issue and the things that come along with that. Because you're right, with Nikola Jokic, once he came back to the bubble and his physique was different, conditioning was different, we've seen the kind of player that he's turned into, a 2-time league MVP, and it looks like on the cusp of winning his first NBA championship. I think there's a larger sense here of why we discuss this in the ways that we do, because I think for Mavericks fans and for us that watch and cover him, we believe that there's a level that he can get to. I'm not going to say he's ever going to look like Giannis. He's never going to look like LeBron James. But the overall point is, if he can get to that kind of level of conditioning and sustain that, the chances of his long-term success and, more important, the franchise success in terms of winning playoff games and championships, that just exponentially grows based on the way that we believe he is as a player and what he means to this franchise going forward in that way.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when you're dealing with historic usage rates and there's some conversation about I remember Jason Kidd early in the season last year, after Luka had that, I think it was 9 straight games with 30 plus points right out of the gate, second only to Wilt Chamberlain. I think there was comments about, he might not make it to Christmas for the workload. So I think when you're dealing with that type of responsibility with the workload, you have to be even that much more, physically, just 100% or whatever you want to say, for, how you're approaching the nutrition, the day-to-day, rehab, all of that stuff. And I think, an interesting part of it heading into next season will be, I think, just how they kind of balance out his game responsibilities with, assuming Kyrie Irving is back, not to jump the gun too much on the next part of it. But, I think if he can find, ways to be able to pick his spots within the flow of the offense instead of having to set the table so much, so often, maybe that allows him, to have a better balance of that sort of workload. And just be able to have more off the court ability to manage his physical whatever you want to call it. I don't know the best term to describe it, but just the maintenance, I guess you could say, throughout a full season. Because if you have a heavy usage rate and you're coming off a game, how much physical maintenance, if you will, are you going to be able to do? It's a lot of keep him off his feet. Let's get through the full season sort of thing. But if you're not having that taxing workload as much, maybe there's more that can be done that can kind of go into the process as well.
Yeah, and that's a terrific point about the usage rate and the maintenance that comes along with that, because if Kyrie is going to be back with this team, his ability to help manage some of this is going to be ensuring that all of these guys are being able to be in the same position to be able to do what they have to do going forward here. So look, for Luka, the biggest thing for him is the conditioning, the way that he needs to be, and what that means for his teammates in terms of the kind of game that he's going to be playing. Because here's where I go with this too, is not only the maintenance for Luka Doncic from a game-to-game basis, but how that can inform how his overall game begins to change as well. Because if he's going to be playing with Kyrie Irving, there could be some off-ball stuff that he can start to do a little bit more in terms of how that looks for his conditioning. They can be able to be in position to do much better now. So look, I like the fact that we're seeing this from Luka. I like the fact that obviously it's out there. But for me, this is about not only his long-term conditioning in terms of what that means for his teammates, but also how that can inform his game in terms of game improvements that allows him to move off the ball a little bit more, be able to be more creative within the offense, and really put more pressure on defenses based on his ability to move more. And that can only be done with having the kind of consistent conditioning and movement that allows him to do that. I think that's where my mind goes with this in terms of why this is so important and why this continues to be a thing that we talk about when it comes to him in that way.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think if you break down someone's approach to a game inside a game, Luka, he'll take a lot of step back threes. He gets to the paint a lot. But I think whenever there's a fatigue factor, you're naturally going to start taking more of those step back threes. And they may be a lower percentage because you're kind of choosing to take that shot because it's less physically taxing than you are to just keep breaking someone down over and over again to get into the paint. So I think that's one of those examples. If you have that sort of stamina throughout a full game, a full season, a little bit better, maybe, one or two of those step back threes turns into a higher efficiency drive, for the rest of the offense. And, it's just crazy to think about little things like that. Cause I'm sure there's many other examples, but the guy is already so efficient. It's just it's crazy to think oh, okay, well, there's a potential for some of those, I guess you could say optimizations in kind of his, approach. Then you're talking about just crazy historic type of player as the final result. He's we're nitpicking essentially because he's already all NBA first team for 4 straight seasons, and then it's just crazy to think that there's even greater potential to be tapped into. And then you're talking about truly like perspective of history. That's a crazy player to be
And
able to have.
yeah, for sure. And I think that right there crystallizes why there are so many of us who watch and cover him, and fans who love to watch him play are frustrated because you're right. My man's a first team all NBA selection for 4 years in a row. He averaged 32, 9 and 8 this past year. And yet he is doing this without the peak physical conditioning that we believe that he can reach based on the talent and what we believe is his work ethic, knowing how generational of a player that he is, which brings up the idea of how scary this possibly could be if he does consistently get into that kind of shape. What kind of numbers historically could he put up for the next several years if he gets there? All that to say is the fact that he's 24 years old, 4-time first team all NBA selection, and is doing this while not being at quote unquote optimal condition is really kind of frightening. It just gives you an idea of the kind of player that we're talking about here, to where we say, look, Luka, just get into a little bit better shape and you can be even better, beside the fact that you're already one of the best players in the league and clearly are on a path to be one of the greatest players of all time. Just get in a little bit better shape and who knows what you can even do. That to me is the scariest part about all of this, is that there's another level that he can get to. And I think more importantly for me on this as well is what that does for him on the defensive end, because we know offensively he's going to continue to be the gifted passer and the scorer who can score on all three levels, all of those kinds of things. But if Jason Kidd's identity for this team is to be better on the defensive end, it reminds me of something that Eric Spoelstra said just recently when it came to the Miami Heat going to the NBA Finals. What he said was, you can't build a great defense if your best player isn't willing to play defense. And that to me will speak volumes of this team. If Luka Doncic gets into the kind of physical shape that allows him to be better on the defensive end, as well as what he already is on the offensive end, and then how that permeates and trickles down to the rest of his teammates, knowing that that dude, who is one of the 5 best players on this planet, is now committing himself not just to his conditioning, but what that means for him on the defensive end as well.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think if you think back to even when the Mavs were their best defensively in the the recent last few seasons, like during their Western Conference Finals run, you would often see Dorian Finney-Smith, Reggie Bullock, Dwight Powell. Those guys would make extra efforts that you may not necessarily have if you say Luka swap you out with Jimmy Butler for our defense, like those types of things. And I don't know the ceiling of what defensively a guy like Luka or even like a Jokic could be, but as you're seeing with the Nuggets in the finals, Jokic is being complimented for his defensive impact. Like he had a huge game 3 as a rim protector, and that's not something you even people call him a liability on that end like the last couple of years. And he's in game 3 of the NBA Finals, however many games it's been the whole season. That's we're approaching 100 games played, I'm sure, and he's making an impact as a rim protector. That's a true testament to that, that conditioning level that we kind of talked about. And as you mentioned with the Eric Spoelstra comment, that's a great comment too, because the Nuggets, they're not getting picked on as a result of that, and that used to be the case, but now it's there's not only just viability, but there's actual legitimate impact being made. And I guess that's just the great example. You don't want your best player to be hunted as having his man being brought into ball screen actions and then just wearing him out. Teams may still try that regardless, because Steph Curry is in impeccable shape as well. But the Mavs, when they played them in the Western Conference Finals, would bring his man up all the time. But at least a key difference, with that conditioning level is that Steph is able to show and recover, hedge and recover, and the ball screen coverage. I don't think you would have Luka do that right now, because that would, that's more taxing physically. So I guess it's a give or take. If that makes your defense a little more impactful to have him hedge and recover, then that could maybe elevate things a little bit more. You add some more talent around him on that end as well, and then your defense improves just a lot, and it gives you more optionality, especially in the playoffs when you have those superstar talents. You got to account for Jamal Murray's, you got to account for the Steph Curry's. You got to be able to throw them off their game, as the Mavs have done during that Western Conference Finals run, by little things like Dwight Powell playing close to the level of the screen against Donovan Mitchell. But you can't always have other people as that sort of option. You got to also have some of those layers from your best player as well to have like that high level defense. So I guess that's just pretty much my general thought is like, it just gives you a lot more options, raises your floor and your ceiling as well. When you can kind of use your best player in different ways beyond just like hoping that they're not going to get hunted as often.
Well, whether it's skinny Luka, light Luka, whatever, it seems like Luka is committing himself, at least for the interim, to getting into better shape, and what that means for the Mavericks and for everyone in Mavs Twitter who lit up seeing all of that, including myself. Not even gonna lie to you, lit up myself, seeing Luka get out there and doing what he's doing. We'll see what that means for him going forward. When it comes to the business of this team, though, obviously we are less now than 2 weeks away from the NBA draft, which will be on Thursday, June the 22nd. But Kyrie Irving, of course, is the number one priority for this team. Mark Stein of Substack reporting that, look, we saw the report earlier this week that Kyrie was trying to recruit LeBron James to come to the Dallas Mavericks. We know that that's a pipe dream at this point. But more so, he and Chris Haynes discussing themselves is the idea that for Kyrie Irving and for the Mavericks, this may be a quote-unquote subtle confirmation that Kyrie Irving is, in fact, coming back to the Dallas Mavericks, and that Kyrie wants to be seen, according to Mark Stein, as a quote-unquote recruiter for the Mavericks and trying to prove his value, but not just as a player, but beyond that and what it means to help improve the Mavericks overall. Do you get that kind of sense when it comes to Kyrie Irving? Because I tend to do myself based on what we have seen unfold this week, and things trending toward the idea that Kyrie Irving is going to be back. It's just a matter of years and money based on what we know right now. But the layer of him being a recruiter and wanting to see this Mavericks team improve, I find to be interesting given what they had to give up to go get him in the first place. And now him being in this position to feel that way about this team.
Yeah, I agree with the sentiment. Kyrie, and like the value of his contract goes beyond just the on the court production, because in his instance, a lot of players do like playing with him. The idea of joining a team, we even saw like with the buyout market this year. Like I know everyone's gonna say those things like after they sign, but Justin Holiday did say an appealing part of joining the Mavericks was to play with Kyrie and Luka as well. And, when the front office is kind of configured for the relationships sort of approach, like with Nico Harrison and you have Kyrie, I think that's an important like kind of add-on to have, is to have more sort of, I guess you could say, recruiters or recruiting tools to be able to bring talent into your organization. And, I think, with the Mavs being kind of restricted with their spending like mechanisms, to a taxpayer MLE, I believe they'll probably be, depending on the contract Kyrie signs, I'm assuming it'll be like, around a max, if not a max. That's just like the general idea. That's not like a reporting thing, but it'll probably be like a 2-year, $10 million deal that they're probably going to be looking at to add somebody. If a free agent had expectations of signing for like, $10 million per year, $13 million per year, but the market didn't have that available, the hope is that, okay, well, at least I can play with Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic if I take that lower contract than what my original expectations were. So I think that's like a big, like I guess part of it, because then players like Denver Nuggets had their tax MLE go to Bruce Brown, and he's a big part of their team this year. Like even just 1 out of 9, 1 out of 8 players receiving like those playoff rotation minutes. If you can get somebody who's valuable in that one of those 8 or 9 spots using your tax MLE, that just goes a long way. And if recruiting value of Kyrie helps you in that regard, then that's a very helpful thing for sure.
I think the commitment that at least Kyrie appears to be showing, given the idea that he wants to see this team improve and is willing to go out and talk to individuals to see and gauge their interest. I find it interesting that the name that he decided to use to show that kind of commitment was the biggest name that you could get in LeBron James. They're like, hey, I'm talking to LeBron James. Look at me. I'm committed to helping this team improve, which if I'm Nico Harrison and the rest of the front office, and I'm like, thanks, Kyrie. Appreciate that. But there's no way that we can get LeBron James. But I think it's a bigger signal based on what his commitment appears to be, is that he wants to be a part of the recruitment process to at least use his name and the value that he has as a player going into his 13th year in the league this upcoming year as a guy that alongside Luka Doncic, this is going to be a destination place to play. Because look, let's make no mistake about it. The Mavericks have swung and missed on a lot of big name free agents over the years, and Dallas has not been seen, quote unquote, as a destination for free agents. And yes, they had to move heaven and earth to go get Kyrie Irving. But now that you have him here, how do you utilize this to be able to help improve your roster? And if you brought Nico Harrison and Jason Kidd here because of their ability to have great relationships with players and other coaches around the league and what that means for recruitment, then all of this would make sense that Kyrie Irving would want to be on the same wavelength, because that's the reason why you brought Nico Harrison and Jason Kidd in, was because of the relationships that they have with players across the league and what that could mean for improving this roster here. Kyrie Irving, it looks like, wants to be a part of that. And I think if you're a Maverick fan, that's a good sign about what he's thinking about in terms of coming or wanting to come back to Dallas for this season and beyond at this point.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one element of it that's kind of interesting to think about is, like, we weren't that long ago from Kyrie criticizing media, talking about Lakers speculation for
Correct.
him. So what's kind of entertaining is it's like he's a media critic, but he's also media savvy. Like, he knows exactly like how to send a
Very
message.
much so. Yes.
And he definitely knew, if I use that name, I'm gonna send shockwaves, and then that's gonna be the biggest story imaginable. And so, the message, if the message intended is, I'm wanting to, put my roots down and help the Mavericks, recruit, and I'm going to stay here, then, that was pretty loud and clear to use LeBron James' name, for sure. So I just thought that was interesting overall, because it's like just interesting to see how the cycle changes from a week and a half ago. You can go from Kyrie, how can we get him to the Lakers, sign and trade, this, that. And then all of a sudden, it's like Kyrie reaches out to LeBron James.
Exactly.
To recruit into the Mavericks. Yeah, it's definitely an entertaining time of year.
Yeah, it's definitely wild, because if Mark Stein, who also, was detailing some of the idea that with Kyrie Irving quelching the idea that he wants to go to Los Angeles, and some of this could be seen as a move or a tactic to show Dallas, like, look, I don't want to go to Los Angeles. And so much so that I want to try to get guys to come here to show you how much more I'm committed to being a part of this team. Now, there could be some of that on the other hand, where Kyrie is clearly recognizing, based off of reports and what we're hearing, that the Lakers simply have no interest in acquiring him because of what they would have to do to their roster in order to get Kyrie Irving. But at the same time, I just found it to be very interesting that would be the name that he used. But more importantly, it gives, I think, for a lot of us, more confirmation that Kyrie Irving is indeed going to be back with this team. The question is, are you going to give him the 4 years at $210 million, the 5 years at $272, which he's eligible for, and the Mavericks can't give him based on having his bird rights, and what that then does mean for the rest of this offseason when it comes to what they do in the draft in the next couple of weeks and then getting to free agency. Which is where we'll end here our show today. We're less than 2 weeks away from the NBA draft. Is there a name for you? Let's just go down this road for this episode today. If there's a name, if the Mavericks do keep the 10 pick, that you want them to see take there, given what we're starting to see, maybe a little bit in terms of some movement, some names that may be sliding or not sliding. Is there a name that you say you get to draft night, they keep the pick, that you want to see them take in June with the NBA draft?
Yeah, I think if he's available, I think, one that's kind of somewhat realistic. I think Taylor Hendricks would probably be a big one.
Mm-hmm.
There's some projections where, he goes pretty early, but there's, others where, other prospects kind of fill in the gaps, and then he ends up getting past that, Orlando and Indiana range, and then ends up being available, in Dallas. Mock drafts are always, very different than the reality for the most part. But that's a name that I like a lot. I think it would be harder to immediately bring in a rim protector and expect immediate results, because, I initially started out, writing about the Pacers, and it took Miles Turner a couple seasons to really, kind of, fire on all cylinders as a rim protector. And he even started out at the 4 spot. The NBA is very different than it was back then. But still, It's very hard to get the timing down, the communication, be the anchor. So I think if you can have someone who's got a little bit more size than what the Mavericks have now at the 4, who can switch on screens and just like make that, like, it's not really like the most challenging read to make, like just that low man rotation from the weak side corner, like weak side shot blocker stuff. Like that doesn't really require a ton of like, super sophisticated, understanding. That's just more of an instinctual thing. I think, having someone with the attributes that can kind of do that from day one and then build on it going forward, and isn't a bad shooter because, Hendricks, he can knock down shots, attack closeouts. I think there's some further upside than just like, the 3-and-D sort of label, that some options may be, available to the Mavs for that 4 spot. And I think, that helps you just rebalance your roster like from day one, because then you can move Reggie Bullock back, from the 4 to the 3. Because I mean, like, honestly, after the Kyrie trade, when you lose Dorian Finney-Smith, they're really small. Like I was in Denver to cover that. Like I think it was like the first game out of the All-Star break or right before the All-Star break. But Dorian wasn't on the team anymore. I got a really close look to see that Michael Porter Jr. looked very similar size to Dwight Powell. He did a Euro step and just like, kind of finished through his chest. And I was like, oh my goodness, like this is a small team. Like, you got Josh Green at the 3, you got Reggie Bullock at the 4, and then Justin Holiday, another element to it. He's like 185 pounds. Like, I think a lot of people kind of get caught up in height as being a big thing. It goes more than that. Like if you're 6'7", but you're like 190, 185,
yeah,
you're filling in for Dorian Finney-Smith, who's like 220, 225. That matters a lot, especially if you're switching and playing up, like guarding up a position. And I think they just need someone who's more closer to that, that 220-ish pounds sort of range. Hendricks may need to fill out more, but I do think that, that's the general vision as he kind of grows, like to be that. And then maybe, even further along the line, maybe he can slide over and be like a micro ball 5, sort of like a Draymond Green, if everything goes, like the perfect development plan. But yeah, that's probably my general, my thought is like probably Hendricks would be a really like safe option and high upside still.
Yeah, if he's there, that's a name that I love as well. And his ability to be able to be a defensive player that gives you length, gives you size, gives you enough quickness and ability to move laterally. That, to me, I think is what's needed for this team. Look, I'm starting to get on the train of the idea of maybe you might want to move down a little bit, maybe try to go get some value, maybe try to find yourself still drafted within the top 15 or so of the NBA draft, but being able to maybe swap something with Atlanta if they're maybe trying to move off of Clint Capella and maybe give you a big man, but you can still remain in the first round. Those are some of the things that I'm starting to think about as we get closer to the NBA draft. On our next episode on Monday, we'll be able to have Richard Stamen, Mavs draft, is going to be joining us on the show. We're going to be loving to bounce some ideas off of him as well on what he's thinking. But Taylor, for Hendricks, he is a name that I think for a lot of Mavericks fans, if he is there, he would be the ideal fit given the skill set that you described and what that can mean for helping improve this team, especially given the fact that going younger with cheaper talent is going to be kind of the way that these teams are going to have to build themselves given the new rules of the collective bargaining agreement. So, as I mentioned, less than a couple of weeks away from the NBA draft, a lot to still get to before we get to the NBA draft here in less than 2 weeks. Grant, before we get out of here, tell the folks where we can find you and the work that you got going as we get closer to the NBA draft here.
Yeah, for sure. You can check out all my written content on DallasBasketball.com, part of SI.com's Mavericks platform. And then, I'll post some things closer to the draft on my Twitter account at Grant Afseth. And yeah, we'll definitely be doing more episodes for sure leading up to the draft on here as well.
Yeah, for sure. As I mentioned, we're going to have Richard Stamen, Mavs draft, is going to be joining us here on the program on Monday. So really looking forward to that. So while you take this episode in over the weekend, get yourself ready. Going to talk to Mavs draft. He's going to have a lot of nuggets for us as well before we get to the NBA draft. You can find me on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports, of course, Mavs Insider for 105 through the Fan. I'll be posting my notes from time to time there as well. If you want to follow me there on Twitter at Kevin Gray Sports, and be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. That's it for this episode of Inside the Mavs. Again, thank Grant for all of his insights on this episode of Inside the Mavs. Make sure you download and subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcast for free. Make sure you give it a 5-star rating, write a review while you're there, and tell your friends and family to download Inside the Mavs wherever they get their podcast for free. For Grant Abseth, my name is Kevin Gray. We'll talk to you Monday on our next episode of Inside the Mavs. We'll talk to you later. Peace.